What can suburbs and small towns do to mitigate and adapt to climate change and become more resilient overall? As a permaculture urbanist, I'll distill some lessons I learned writing a green neighborhood plan and city grant proposals, building a neighborhood garden, and visiting eco-villages all over the country. I'll even show how these activities helped me profitably sell a house in 2010 during the depths of the housing crash that I had bought in 2007, right before the crash. Plus, I'll provide some interesting links and a bonus download. Welcome to Hedonicity, best practices for sustainably abundant cities. Just a quick note about that bonus download. If you have to run and need to grab it before the end of this episode, just be sure to check that there isn't a little white subscribe icon below this video. If there is, you'll want to be sure to click that so you don't miss the rest of this episode or any future episodes. All right, let's start with the big picture. Human beings occupy half the land area of the Earth. Not coincidentally, we have wiped out half of the living biomass. Why has this happened? Well, modern settlements create deserts in the broadest sense. And there's many definitions of a desert, but to me, the key concept is that the major resources of life, water and sunlight, are mostly wasted. In a desert, the vast majority of photons that hit the surface never encounter a living being before just turning into heat. The vast majority of water drops that fall in a rare rainfall just sheet off the land without being absorbed by any living thing in that environment. What's tragic about many deserts is that they're actually rich in resource flows, but they're not structurally set up for those flows to benefit the enterprise of life. By contrast, in rainforests and grasslands and other places that are much more alive, water and sunlight and nutrients flow through many living beings before they leave the system. The number of beings that a resource is shared with before it leaves the system is one measure of how alive that system is. Hedonicity aims to reverse desertification in the human habitat so we can restore natural habitats and the missing half of life on Earth. With this bigger perspective in mind, let's get to the problem at hand. Basically, we're looking at two situations. The first is, if you live in a suburb near a growing metro, your problem is how to accommodate that growth without having the character of where you lived obliterated. At least that's the way that most of us in that situation tend to think about it. But from the hedonicity perspective, the challenge is how to grow by hedonizing rather than urbanizing. And I'll get into a case study and a checklist later on. The second situation is if you live far from a growing metro. In this case, you're probably car dependent. You probably have to make many long errands to meet your needs. It probably takes quite a bit of effort and cost to get the help you need. You're in a very labor-limited environment. So in this situation, the themes are going to be to get closer to the land, connect with people near and far, and together restore the biodiversity of the region where you live. But the starting point in both cases is the same. You need to build connections between green-minded people and help people discover that they are a lot more green-minded than they realized. Let's start with a case study. This was my student project from my first permaculture design certificate course. Together with two other classmates, our focus was the Green Acres neighborhood adjacent to Indiana University in Bloomington, Indiana. This was a neighborhood of 413 houses, about half of which had become student rentals. Our process was to map the neighborhood and talk with residents to understand their needs. We asked them what kinds of problems the neighborhood faced, and if you've ever attended a neighborhood association meeting, you probably can guess about half of the problems that they mentioned. I have to apologize. Some of these pictures are from 2006, and the technology wasn't up to snuff, so they're quite pixelated. Because we were adjacent to a university, there was a lot of through traffic into the neighborhood by people trying to find a shortcut into the university. There were intersections that had some flooding, and there was lots of student noise. In addition to that, people complained about parking. That's the usual complaint. Trash, not just people forgetting to bring their trash cans in after collection, but also trash left in some yards by students on their way to and from class and after student parties. Some of the yards got boggy. This area right here, for example, is a corner yard between two houses. It became kind of a shortcut for students. There was kind of a boggy spot about where the person in blue is standing, and after it rained that that tended to be a breeding ground for mosquitoes. In addition, the neighborhood association was basically defunct, and people just felt a little bit beaten down, apathetic, and the longtime residents had a simmering resentment to the students with whom they felt very little connection. Now, as problems go, these weren't earth-shattering, but it was a starting point, and in permaculture, we have a saying, the problem is the solution. In other words, look for solutions in the problems themselves. Let me show you what I mean. For the through traffic, one of the things we did almost immediately was put up sign toppers over all of the street signs that indicated the name of the neighborhood that people were in. So it gave people a sense this is actually a place where people live and not just a shortcut. The intersection that was prone to flooding was also really dangerous due to the line of sight. And so we wanted to put in a roundabout with a rain garden in that intersection and install rain gardens all the way up the street in the green strips so that they would capture some of the runoff that would go into feeding the flooding in that intersection. Months later, when we approached the city engineer, we were kind of delighted and surprised to discover that she had already independently thought of these things and made drawings of a roundabout for that intersection with a built-in rain garden. The advantage of a roundabout is that it does slow traffic, especially through that intersection. People tended to fly through that intersection at about 40 miles an hour when the default speed limit was 25, and it probably should have been zoned even slower than that. Another thing that the neighborhood association did long after my time was paint the utility boxes to indicate that this was the Green Acres neighborhood. The cure for apathy was to start engaging with people on a more regular basis. And I'll get into how we did that in a moment. But in the long run, what we were able to do was build a neighborhood garden and host frequent educational programs. And this really built a lot of enthusiasm among the neighbors. For mosquitoes, we organized neighborhood cleanups to remove tires, which tended to collect rainwater and breed mosquitoes. And we also built and stocked a pond. And I'll get into that in detail in a moment as well. But the biggest problem in the neighborhood was student disturbance. And this was also by far the biggest opportunity, because by rebranding the neighborhood as a green place where you could live your sustainable values and putting that plan in writing with the city and partnering with the university, we thought maybe we could change the population of the neighborhood from apathetic, hard-partying students to students who were really interested in our shared aspiration of making this a much greener place to live. That strategy really paid off. Now, as you can imagine, the university was not particularly interested when I showed up at their door as kind of a scraggly townie saying that they should partner with us. But after a winter of knocking on doors in the Service Learning Office and the School of Public and Environmental Affairs and selling the benefits of having a laboratory for their programs within easy walking distance to campus, we managed to get them involved. Now, it's not like we did this right away. We had a few things to do first. I ended up living in the neighborhood, so here's my timeline. I did the permaculture design with 2 classmates in May of 2006. The neighborhood association relaunched and began rebranding immediately in June. I moved into a rental in August, and a year later my wife and I bought a house in the neighborhood. Of course, that was immediately before the housing crash, but because of the green rebranding, there was a lot of enthusiasm for this neighborhood. Over those 3 years, it really became one of the hotter neighborhoods to live in. And for that reason, when unfortunately we had to move and sell the house in 2010, we were able to do so at a very slight profit, completely bucking the market trend. As a neighborhood, our first task was to start building a community of green-minded people. We kind of made it up as we went along, but in retrospect, long before Generation Z got a hold of the language, I was able to formulate it, no cap, as CAP, Commons, Activities, and Partnerships. So the first step in building community is to either find, or if it doesn't exist, start building shared areas and resources where you can actually meet neighbors on somewhat neutral territory. One of my fellow students, Anne, took the lead on this, and this is her house on a street that had no sidewalk. She was at the top of a little hill, and people tended to pause when they were walking their dogs or out with their children in a stroller. So she decided to put the bench there as a place that was a public-private space. This is a design pattern straight out of Christopher Alexander's Design Patterns book that we had studied as part of our permaculture course. And it worked beautifully. People would come up to the top of the hill, and without even thinking about it or half noticing it, they might sit down at the bench. Anne had a little dog that would bark in the house, alerting her that there were people out there. And she would rush outside with some lemonade and strike up a conversation. Little by little, in this way, she was able to start meeting her neighbors and making allies among longtime residents and students. And if they seemed amenable to it, she actually described the permaculture project and the vision we'd put together for the neighborhood. Also, immediately in June, the neighborhood began with regular activities. Anne and her neighbors organized a ice cream social, some potlucks, a solstice parade for the children, all kinds of events. Later on, we had regular parties and a monthly event with guest speakers. And to this day, the neighborhood has weekly shared dinners. The key to making activities work for building communities is frequency. You want weekly, monthly, and seasonal gatherings and events to bring people together. When I toured eco-villages where spirits were down and the fabric of the community was falling apart, it was always the case that although they were still very good at dividing up the work that needed to be done, they were not so good at bringing people together to do the work or even sometimes have the fun together. So scheduled activities are key. And finally, of course, partnerships. We partnered with the city planning office and the university. And depending on where you live, you might also partner with indigenous communities. It took about a year to build a big enough group of people to move on to the next stage, which was actually Anne had bought the property adjacent to hers, so she owned the corner lot and decided to gift that to the neighborhood to be a neighborhood garden. So she decided to rent out that other house to green-minded students and gift the corner yard to the neighborhood to become a neighborhood garden. The anchor feature of that neighborhood garden was to be a pond right where that mucky mosquito breeding spot was. Now you might wonder, wouldn't a pond breed even more mosquitoes? Well, it turns out that a Purdue extension study had shown that a well-stocked pond reduces the mosquito population by 90% or more because the fish and amphibians in the pond eat the mosquito larvae and also keep the surface too disturbed for the mosquitoes to lay too many eggs. So one of the experienced permaculturists hired a machine, dug out the pond area, we lined it, and in the inset below, that's me with a sledgehammer breaking up Anne's driveway. And that's also me over here placing the chunks of concrete from the driveway to anchor the edges of the pond liner. After the project, Anne filled her driveway with river rock, which was easy to walk on barefoot, and also was a permeable surface, allowing rainwater to soak in rather than just slide into the street and contribute to the flooding down the hill. Early in our survey work, we had placed little flags on the corner lot on lines of constant contour, so you could walk along those lines and be walking neither uphill nor downhill. And we had a garden work day where we invited neighbors to come and help put in large sheet mulches along those lines of contour to create garden beds. Here's Anne right next to the pond, and as the pond took shape, we brought in healthy vascular plants from elsewhere in the county to aerate the pond. And if more than 3 people ask for the plant list, I'll go ahead and post a link to it. Just understand that the ideal species mix will vary somewhat from region to region. Not too long after we planted up the pond, it started to spring to life, and our weekly gardening parties and monthly guest speakers on garden-related topics really made this the place to be in the neighborhood. It's not like you have to do exactly what we did, but this is just a somewhat dramatic example of what's possible as a neighborhood starts to go green. Now, the CAP formula is your first step no matter whether you live close or far from a growing metro. But for what happens next, let's take those 2 cases one at a time. If you live close to a growing metro, of course, you begin building connections with CAP, no CAP, anyway. And then your next step will be to organize and push for multifamily mixed-use transit-oriented development. And that means pushing to change the zoning from R1 to maybe as much as R3 or R4, or creating new transit-oriented zoning in areas near your neighborhood. Now, this is the thing that people fear to do, mainly because they don't know their neighbors very well. But if you have a strong neighborhood that brings new people into a strong community with weekly, monthly, and seasonal events, then it's much easier to bring in higher density housing because you're going to feel a lot more connection with people and a lot more control over your shared destiny. While you're at it, you should also work with your local transit authorities to put in protected bicycle access, especially to schools, and full transit access to the nearest town, regional, or city center. You don't need to carve the space out of any green areas. You just simply take it out of existing lanes. And of course, people will be a little bit shocked at this and tend to resist it. But bear in mind that bicycles and public transit can carry 6 to 10 times more people per lane than a car lane, so they ease congestion. Moreover, as you start to zone things a little bit more mixed use, you'll have businesses, markets moving into the area, and it'll start to become a much more convenient place to live, where you don't have to get into your car as much to get things done. And that also eases congestion. Now, the reality is, if you're adjacent to a growing metro, there will be a big push to expand highways that connect to that metro. And that's what you need to fight, because with good transit, you won't need it. And as for the character of the neighborhood, well, even Singapore managed to preserve 7,000 historic homes. So it's possible to urbanize and maintain historical character anywhere in the world. Once these elements are in place, then it should be pretty straightforward to follow the rest of the Edenicity plan, described in a very abstract way in the Edenicity reference design, which you can find in the description. Now, what if you live far from any growing metro? Well, in this case, of course, you want to connect with neighbors. This is more important here than anywhere, because I know from having lived country myself that it's not a labor-rich environment. Once you start to connect with green-minded neighbors, the next step is to either talk to a permaculturist or learn some permaculture together. Because permaculture, or applied ecology, is a design system to meet human needs, mainly in rural environments, while healing the earth. Now, when I lived country, one thing that struck me was how many people lived on several acres with no grazing animals, not even any horses, that they kept mowed with a riding mower. I would literally bicycle past miles of these gravel road suburban lots. We're out in the country where people were riding their mowers all the time. I forgot to footnote it here, but a beautifully manicured lawn like this has about 1/100th the biodiversity of natural forest or grassland soils, and has up to 1,000 times less ability to hold on to critical nutrients in the soil. I'll put the link in the description. The key thing to do here is to upgrade those areas from lawns to productive food or forest systems. If that seems really daunting, if you don't really know how to proceed, that's where getting a professional permaculture designer on the job can really help. I've visited multiple eco-villages that were founded out where land was relatively cheap, about 20 to 40 minutes drive from the nearest city. What ends up happening is that many people have to drive into town to work high enough paying jobs to maintain their lifestyles, and their kids end up either busing or driving with them to go to school. And then in some cases, they all meet back home in the evening, and then parents have to drive kids to soccer practice or what have you in the evening. And so you end up spending like 2 hours on the road every day, which, as you can imagine, is terrible for the environment. For anyone starting to face that situation, my suggestion is to start forging a new identity with your green-minded neighbors. This would be a regional identity restoring biodiversity and indigenous livelihoods as much as possible. You should definitely search for and apply for grants at the local to national level. And I've known a number of people who've run paid programs, such as summer camps, that were ecology themed for both children and adults. So the idea here is to tap into the energy of cities for some of your resources. And finally, reduce fossil fuel use by building a strong connection with the land. You don't want to be running into town every day. Joel Salatin, the famous author of You Can Farm, didn't take family vacations, but stayed on the farm with his family throughout the year. Now, some ways that I've observed that people make this a lot easier for themselves is by expanding nearby shared spaces. So having a nearby library, school, transit, and assisted living facilities that are in small towns dotted throughout the land really takes the edge off of the long errands that you'd otherwise have to run. Those are just a few pointers to get started. I will definitely return to this topic every now and then, because rural and indigenous livelihoods are the flip side of the whole concept of Edenicity. Now, don't forget to get your copy of the Greener Village Blueprint that walks you through the CAP formula. And here's a couple of other videos that go into the urban aspects of the Edenicity plan. Thanks for watching. Take care. Stay green. See you next time.